Hi guys, in this video we're going to be talking about how to use the histogram, why it should be your best friend in photography and why it's so important. But don't worry, it's really easy to understand. Let's take a look. Okay, so what is a histogram? Well, put simply, it's a graphical display that you'll see on the back of your camera when you take a photograph or when you press play after you've taken the photograph, and you'll see the amount of light that's hit the sensor. From the histogram you can tell if your photograph is underexposed or overexposed. It really is that simple. But let's take a look at the histogram in practice. Now, the easiest way to understand how a histogram works is to visualize your scene in black and white, because typically the histogram on your camera displays the luminescence, which is the brightness of the scene. It doesn't display the colors until you look at what's called an RGB histogram, which is completely different. So the simple histogram that you'll see is just a luminescent histogram, which just displays blacks, midtones and whites. So the easiest way to view your scene is to turn it black and white and implement that into your histogram. We've got this Nikon SLR on my desk. My desk is a beachy kind of colour, and the wall is almost white, not quite white. If we imagine this scene in black and white, which is the best way of understanding the histogram, we'll actually see that when we turn the scene black and white, that wall is about 5% black, not actually white. So that needs to reflect in the histogram on the back of the Fuji camera here. So if we have a look at that, you can see at the minute that the histogram is nowhere near the right hand side, so that's underexposed. We need to push that white line there as close to the right hand side as we can, just to illustrate the fact that that white wall should in fact be nearly white. So what we're going to do is to slide the exposure down until that histogram moves over, so you can see the scene is getting brighter. We could actually go about there. If we went any further than there, we risk clipping, and that means that we'd start losing detail, losing information that we wouldn't be able to retrieve. So I'm just going to point out now that we are actually shooting RAW, so this is going to give us more information than if we were shooting a JPEG. So as a RAW photograph, I've actually got the camera set to display a natural live view, which gives us a more accurate histogram. You can actually see the histogram moving, the blacks moving there as I toggle between. So this histogram is very close to perfect. I actually do think we could go a bit further to the right, but I think for safety we'll go there. Again, seeing the scene in black and white, that histogram there, that side of the histogram would represent the large amount of white, nearly white space, should I say, around there. That's why there's quite a high bar, because there's quite a lot of white area. There's nothing actually on the left hand side of the histogram, so that tells us, even though the photograph looks like the camera's got some black areas around the lens, the histogram is actually saying that there's only about 80% black in the photograph. There's nothing actually 100% black. So that's good news, because it means we've not clipped the black areas, which means there's shadow detail in the black as well. And actually in the middle of the histogram there's actually no detail there at all, and that basically tells us that there's no information containing 50% grey. So again, remember, the scene is black and white and the histogram is just showing us brightness. So imagine 50% grey. In the middle there's actually nothing in this photograph that represents 50% grey. We are very close with 40 and 30% grey, and they're obviously going to be the mid-tone areas there, or the inside of the silver part of the Nikon camera. But I'm really confident that that histogram is pushed safely to as far right as possible. There's nothing on the left that's clipping, and that histogram accurately represents the scene. There's a bit of a myth where people think that a histogram should look like a hill or a mound, or there's a typical way, a perfect histogram, generically speaking. So there's no such thing as a generically perfect histogram. A histogram should always reflect the scene in front of the camera. So there's nothing 50% grey, so that's why there's nothing showing in the middle of the, or 60% grey, or 70% grey really. I'd say that was about 80% grey, that line there. And there's only a very little amount of it as well. So there's nothing really very much on that side of the histogram at all. So that's really good. That histogram is pushed to the right. We're always looking to expose to the right with the histogram. That's really good, because it means you've got all the detail coming onto the sensor, which means you're going to get all the editing possibilities, the best out of your camera. You're not going to be brightening the photograph up in post and losing detail, losing quality. So that's the best way of exposing that scene. White, nearly white on the top, nearly black in the camera, and the histogram reflects that perfectly. So I can focus on that Nikon logo. You see the focus peaking dots there, and I know that photograph is perfectly exposed, and when I get it back to the computer, I'm 100% confident that there's no issues with the exposure on this photograph. So I'll take that shot. Right then, so if we look at the back of the camera, just point out that we're shooting RAW there. I want to point out as well that when you look at the back of the camera, the histogram actually displays a JPEG histogram. Even though we're shooting RAW, that histogram is actually the JPEG details, because when you look at the back of your camera, you're always actually seeing a JPEG image. You're not seeing a RAW image. So it does look slightly more contrasty there than when we took it. Okay, so that would actually give you the JPEG for that. So that's worth knowing, because it means that if you can see it there on the RGB histogram, the RGB histogram is actually telling us that we're clipping very slightly on the top of the Nikon camera there, which is why it's flashing. And that information it's telling us that we've actually lost, but we know that's not the case. So I know we can ignore that histogram because that's the JPEG histogram and doesn't relate at all to the RAW. So I feel safe that when we get back and look at them photographs, I'm not going to be upset that I've overexposed or clipped any information. Right then, so let's have a look at that photograph in Lightroom. Now we visualise the exposure in black and white just to make it easier for us to understand the histogram. So let's turn the scene black and white there. And if we've got the blinkies on there as well. So basically what will happen is, if there were any areas of the photograph that we did either clip the black areas or the white areas, it would actually show red or blue areas in the picture. So the histogram is actually pushed nicely to the right there, illustrating the brighter areas of the photograph, and it's almost touching the left hand side there as well, illustrating the black areas of the photograph. Now this histogram is actually saying that we're very nearly black on the left hand side. There's a little bit of a gap there, and there is actually a tiny amount of the photograph which is almost touching. I'd say it pretty much is touching on the right hand side. Now, when you do product photography, you make an executive decision. You're looking for reflections in the product. Obviously, the reflections, the brighter part of a reflective surface, are going to tend to clip. Now, that basically means is if you were doing a landscape photograph and you had the sun in the shot, then obviously the sun would have to clip. You could never expose the histogram for the sun. It's just too bright, and that's very similar to a product photograph when you've got reflective areas there, obviously just not as bright as the sun. So if we brought the exposure down, you'll see the blue area showing. That means we've clipped the blacks there, and if we lift the exposure up, we can go all the way up. There's the red there, and it's just over a stop before we've clipped the reds there. So yeah, very, very happy with that exposure. I would be more than happy to edit that photograph knowing that we've got all the information possible on the sensor, so we've got the best quality we possibly could have done out of that photo shoot. Okay, so how will knowing how to use the histogram improve your photography? It's really simple. It basically means you're going to get better exposures over and over again. You're going to be so much more confident in your photography. That means that when you get back and you look at your photographs, you're not going to be constantly disappointed that they're either overexposed or underexposed, and you have to do more work to them to actually get them to work. So you're going to be really, really happy with the difference that you see in your photography just by learning how to use the histogram. It's honestly my best friend in photography, and I 100% wouldn't use a camera without the histogram straight away for me to see. Okay, the other benefit of a histogram is it's far more accurate than an LCD or your EVF if you're using a mirrorless camera. It might be difficult sometimes, especially on a bright sunny day, to actually see how your exposure is coming out. You can't quite see the screen. It looks okay, it looks nice and bright on the screen, and when you get back you realise because it was such a bright environment it actually was underexposed. But if you keep an eye on, make sure you can keep an eye on the histogram, and then you will get an accurate representation of what the exposure is going to look like. So it's far more accurate than using your LCD for your exposure. Okay, so if you're an auto user and you have your camera set to either the program modes or aperture priority or shutter priority, the histogram works exactly the same way, but you have to use the compensation dial and just keep an eye on the histogram just to make sure that you're in full control of what the camera is trying to do. Now, depending on the exposure mode you might be using, like spot metering or evaluative meter, center weighted, that sort of thing, your camera might be trying to look for an average of 20% grey in the scene. So the histogram is going to tell you whether or not your auto exposure is right or wrong, and then you can adjust using the compensation dial. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's up to you to decide whether or not you want to clip any areas of your photograph. But by looking at the histogram, you can make that decision. So some examples are the sun or bright reflections, as I mentioned, or if you're doing astrophotography, you might need to keep an eye on the left-hand side of the image just to see if you've crushed any of the black areas of your photograph, or on the right-hand side, if you've got a moon or some bright stars in your photograph, you don't want to overexpose or clip that information either. So again, the histogram is vital. Okay, just a reminder, there is a difference between shooting JPEG and RAW with the histogram. If you shoot with a JPEG histogram, you'll actually be getting an accurate display of your photograph afterwards, but you won't be able to recover as much detail as if you were shooting RAW. So I always recommend shooting RAW, just because you'll get that more dynamic range and more ability to recover any of the highlights when you edit the photograph. But obviously, shooting RAW, pushing the histogram to the right will get you the most information and the most light on your sensor without clipping your information. Okay, just a reminder, there is no such thing as a generic perfect histogram. If you're in belief that the histogram should look like a hill or a mound, that is not true. Every histogram should look unique to the image. If you were taking a photograph of a polar bear in the snow on a bright day, then all your detail on your histogram should be on the right-hand side, very nearly the edge of the right-hand side of the image. Likewise, if you were taking a photograph of a black cat on a black blanket, then all the information would be right over to the left-hand side, with very little past the mid-tones, the middle of the histogram. So just remember, every histogram is unique, and you should always be able to tell what the image consisted of just by looking at the histogram. Right, so I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope that was clear enough. It's quite a difficult one to explain, but once you actually put it in practice, it's really, really easy to use, and I can promise you, you won't go back. The histogram is so easy to use, so easy to understand. But yeah, once you get your head around it, it's a valuable tool. So I really hope this video has been useful for you. Please hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Hit the like button, drop me a comment, let me know what you think of the video, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.